Jake Paul ended up winning by TKO against Mike Perry in the 6th round. In my opinion, being objective, Mike Perry had some nice moments in that fight, but they usually came in a round or in a particular sequence where Jake, I think, was doing better, had more output, had more significant strikes. In the end, I think Mike Perry won just one round of the 6, and that's really giving him the benefit of the doubt. Some people who I think were being very objective said Mike Perry didn't win a single round. I wouldn't go that far. I'd say Jake won the first 2, Mike won the 3rd round, and then from there on out, it was a Jake Paul night. But in my opinion, take away the weight draining stuff, because I know everybody's talking about the 40-pound weight difference. I think when you look at Jake objectively, just him, every time he steps into the boxing ring, he looks so much better. His footwork and his pace, I think, were the biggest takeaways for me in this fight. He came out clearly, wanted to knock Mike Perry's head off, was super aggressive from the get-go, and really wanted to get him out of there. And when he couldn't, I thought, man, this is really going to test Jake's gas tank, because if he wore himself out now, Mike Perry has proven he can throw a punch, and he proved it all throughout that fight. In the end, Jake Paul wins. For those who criticize Jake for weight draining his opponents, is it the most fair or noble practice? Maybe not, but some of our favorite names in boxing do it. Gervonta Tank Davis literally is infamous for doing this at this point against Ryan Garcia, against other guys, against essentially all of his opponents since he became a big name star. Weight draining somebody in boxing or trying to fight someone who is smaller than you at a bigger weight is not a foreign practice. So Jake Paul is not a one of one when it comes to that. I will say, though, a lot of people talking about Jake Paul, fight a real boxer. And this sort of goes hand in hand with what I think next, which is, and the headline here on YouTube is, Jake Paul getting a title shot. What we're hearing now from the WBA president is that he literally tweeted this out from his account. He is, quote, not against a title shot for Jake Paul against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And this sort of reinforces what I talked about 2 months ago now, right before we went on break, where I said I knew who Jake Paul's next opponent was after Mike Tyson because they made it so obvious. If you know Jake Paul's history in the boxing world, his first fight against Tyron Woodley, not the second one where he KO'd him in that devastating fashion, that first one, he had Tommy Fury on his undercard, and he had Tommy Fury sign a 2-fight deal with Showtime at the time, the boxing promotion, which has since gone under, unfortunately, sign of the times in the boxing world. But he had Tommy Fury on his undercard to sort of build up his brand on the American side of things. Tommy Fury was famous as a reality TV star. He was an influencer, especially in the UK. He was well known. But in the U.S., as a boxer, he didn't quite have that appeal yet, and Jake thought, hey, why don't I put him on my undercard to really boost up his appeal? I told you about 2 months ago, I thought that Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. was going to be Jake Paul's next opponent after Mike Tyson because Jake strategically placed him on his undercard, and they had a history, and at one point, about a year and a half ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. was the betting favorite, the Vegas favorite, to be Jake Paul's next opponent. An older boxer, past his prime, yes, all these things can be true, had previously been on a losing streak, maybe hadn't been the sharpest that he could have been in terms of physical stature and what he was putting into his body, but those are all rumors, and I'm not going to get too much into that. But he was at one point the betting favorite for Jake to fight next. Now we're hearing from the WBA president he's not opposed to Jake Paul taking a title shot in the WBA's in their championships and within their own promotion against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., it makes perfect sense. And I'll go and take it a step further here. People criticizing Jake Paul for not fighting a real boxer. Valid claims, right? But I think when you look at this, Jake Paul can afford to be hated. Jake Paul can afford to be memed. Jake Paul can afford to have people clown him in the comment section saying, hey, you just took my grandfather out of the retirement home to go ahead and fight him. What Jake Paul cannot afford for there to be is a lack of interest in seeing him fight. And he got dangerously close to that with his 2 previous fights with Ryan Borland and Andre August. And if you don't know who either of those names are, you're sort of proving my point here. Jake Paul, after taking the prize fighting route, decided, you know what? After the Tommy Fury thing, maybe let me take the noble route. Let me take the old school route, and let me fight some tomato cans who are technically boxers and build up my record. There was almost zero interest for both of those fights. And, of course, they sold tickets, right? And Jake Paul knows how to put on an event, but neither of those two were pay-per-view events. There's a reason for that. They knew that they could not sell that as a pay-per-view event. Jake Paul against a literal nobody. not to insult Andre August, but I believe he had not fought in several years. I know that Ryan Borland had retired in 2018 prior to Jake Paul fighting him. Obviously, not the most active or well-known set of opponents. When Jake Paul fought those guys, the internet literally laughed when he posted a face-off against them. And you can look at the top 5, top 10 comments under those posts. They were like, I literally had no idea you were fighting tomorrow. That is Jake Paul's biggest enemy. That's his biggest problem. That's his biggest obstacle. Jake Paul can afford to be hated. He can't afford for the world not to know who he's fighting. Mike Perry, to his credit, on about a month notice, 4 weeks, they made a pretty good event out of this. In my opinion, it was a pay-per-view. I don't think it sold more than 200,000 pay-per-view buys, which is still an incredible number in 2024. And it's why I believe that regardless of pound-for-pound rankings, or regardless of the biggest names, or regardless of ability, Jake Paul is undeniably one of the top 10 biggest pay-per-view stars in the sport of boxing. That is going to be where he wins. And like I said, I think this fight probably sold anywhere from 150,000 to 175,000 pay-per-view buys. Not a ton. Jake Paul reportedly is getting paid about $7 or $10 million base purse before pay-per-view. This sort of covers it. If he sold about 200,000 pay-per-view buys, the event didn't go under. But I'm saying this number, by the way, the 200,000 is not coming from nowhere. I believe that when you look at Nate Diaz, Jake Paul, there was decent amount of hype behind that. That sold 450,000 buys not too long ago. For that reason, I don't think that Mike Perry is nearly the promoter or the name that Nate Diaz is. And I think Jake Paul, his name alone is going to sell you some buys, but probably because of age and just demographic and people who are able to pay for a pay-per-view, anywhere between 150 and 175 is where I think the number is. Definitely, I'd be shocked if it did more than 200,000 pay-per-view buys. We'll see what the final number is. But like I said, did he weight drain Mike Perry? Not really weight drain, but he weighed in at more than 40 pounds heavier than him is what people most likely think on fight night. So he was clearly the bigger guy, the younger guy, the stronger guy, the bigger guy, which was the big difference here. Jake Paul can afford to do that. He just can't afford to face no-name opponents, and that's why the MMA shtick works. At the end of the day, Jake Paul is not in this. He'll say he's in it for legacy, but he's not necessarily in it to take it the old school boxing route. He is a prize fighter. He's in this to make money. How do you make money? You do the pay-per-view model. How do you have a successful pay-per-view model? You have to have big names. There has to be interest, and you're not going to have that with Andre August or Ryan Borland, who everybody said fight a real boxer. He fought 2 technically real boxers, and literally nobody cared. Neither of them were pay-per-view events because the Zone and Jake Paul knew prior to that we cannot sell this at a $65 pay-per-view amount. So obviously the chat is in here. There are a lot of questions. We're going to get to the top 10 quarterback rankings in a second. But I think when it comes to Jake Paul, that is just the reality. You cannot treat him as you can treat him as an actual boxer. That would be an insult. But don't treat him and his path the same way that you would a conventional boxer. Conventional boxing is dead. We are in a new era. And someone like Jake Paul, who already has his built-in audience and ability to sell, should not lower himself to say, let's just do streaming fights. Let's not sell pay-per-views. Let's do DAZN included with your subscription fights. That doesn't make anybody any money. And quite frankly, it's not the best use of Jake Paul's stardom. Promoters know that. Jake knows that. And I think the WBA president knows that, clearly saying, hey, maybe we can get you a title shot next against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. He literally tweeted out from his Twitter account, as our YouTube audience can see, that they are, quote, not against Paul versus Chavez Jr. Let's move on to the